The first thing, though, is having inclusivity in mind. To start off thinking that we're going to design a device that works over the full range of skin tones that are encountered on our planet.
This is Made for Us, the show where we explore how intentional design can help create a world that works better for everyone. I'm your host, Tosin Suleiman. Today, we'll meet the scientist reinventing a medical device that became a household item for millions of people during the COVID pandemic. Pulse oximeters are used to measure oxygen levels in the blood, but studies have shown that these devices tend to be less accurate in patients with darker skin. As Tufts University professor Valencia Koomson began to dig into this research, she thought,
this is fundamentally a sensing and signal processing problem that we can actually solve. We know how to solve.
And that's exactly what she's doing, designing a new type of pulse oximeter that works across diverse skin tones. It's the kind of challenge that draws on her expertise. She's a professor of electrical and computer engineering, and her lab at Tufts focuses on designing biosensors that improve people's quality of life. In this episode, she tells me how she's reimagining a device whose core design has barely changed in 4 decades, and what it takes to get it into the hands of patients who need it. Before we begin, a reminder that now's your chance to help shape future seasons of Made for Us. We want to hear what you think we're getting right and what could be better, and we've put together a quick 4-minute survey which I've linked to in the show notes. As a thank you, 2 winners chosen at random will win a $25 Amazon gift card, and everyone who completes the survey gets our curated reading list, 30+ books recommended or written by past guests. Again, you'll find the link in the show notes, so please take a few minutes to share your thoughts. Now here's my conversation with Professor Valencia Koomson.
My name is Valencia Koomson. I am a professor of electrical and computer engineering at Tufts University, and I'm also the founding director of the Advanced Integrated Circuits and Systems Lab at Tufts.
You have a really fascinating background, engineering and computer science degrees from MIT, a PhD from Cambridge. You're a senior member of the National Academy of Inventors, and you hold a patent. You have another one pending. I wanted to start, though, with before you became a professor. What's the earliest memory that you have of being fascinated by how things work?
Well, when I was very young, at Christmas time, for example, my brother would get a lot of, fun electrical circuit sets to play around with, whereas I would get the dolls. So I used to play around with my brother's electronic set. He had a electronic switchboard where you could play around with resistors and capacitors and antennas. I didn't know what a lot of that meant, but I was always fascinated by how complex systems work. I was always asking questions about, especially our TV, right? How does this box, sit in our living room and we get all these beautiful images and videos? Where does it all come from? And I remember, as an elementary school kid in grades 1, 2, and 3, asking those questions. So I was also fascinated by living organisms as well. So I felt engineering was a really perfect way to bring together all of my fascinations and curiosities.
That's a great story. And when you decided to become an engineer, were you following in the footsteps of anyone in your family? So I don't know if your brother's older than you or if you're the older one.
No, my brother is older, but, my parents didn't attend college, and I didn't have any engineers in my family at all or scientists. So, my parents grew up in the South. They moved to the North in Washington for better job opportunities, in the 1960s, in the midst of the civil rights movement. So I didn't have very many people in my family who had gone to a postgraduate degree level or had pursued degrees in science or STEM or as academic faculty as well.
So let's talk some more about your work. Can you tell us more about your lab at Tufts and what are the big questions that you and your team are preoccupied with right now?
One of the core areas of focus for my lab is, how can we build technology that can directly translate into improving people's health and quality of life? And so that's a central theme. And that's a question I'm always asking myself as we conduct research, as we form partnerships with collaborators, as we write proposals for grant funding. And so I started working in the area of biosensors very early in my career. And we wanted to find ways in which we could build systems that could really help to track biometric data and to do it non-invasively. And we have made such advances over the past, 6 or 7 decades in terms of how we can build systems that can communicate over very long distances, over very short distances, very low power, wearable, wireless. These types of technologies are commonplace now. You can buy them off the shelf and they become very affordable. And we typically see them in the domain of entertainment and for fitness tracking. And so I wanted to see, okay, we have quite a bit we can do just in a handheld device like a mobile phone. You can build a mobile phone that can look at the electrical activity of your heart. It can track your heart rate. It can track blood pressure. It can track so many various vitals. It can track where you are in terms of physical location as well. And so we do so much with these handheld devices. And I wanted to see, okay, how can we take it to the next level and build medical devices that could really be of clinical use? So my focus on biosensors really just directly translated into our work with pulse oximeters. I mean, when we started to study and learn about some of the long-standing accuracy problems in pulse oximeters, especially for people with dark skin pigmentation, my first instinct was, this is fundamentally a sensing and signal processing problem that we can actually solve. We know how to solve. During the COVID-19 pandemic, pulse oximeters really came to light and really it was just became a household product really, as people were encouraged to buy them, to use them at home to track their blood oxygen saturation level. We started to look at the device more closely and kind of say, well, it's pretty much stay the same in terms of its core design for the past 4 decades. How can we improve upon it? How can we modernize it? And so that was my focus even before the pandemic, but it was we kind of shifted gears and placed more focus on that device during the pandemic.
So many of us will have seen a pulse oximeter maybe on our finger at the hospital, but we don't necessarily know what's happening under the hood. Can you walk us through the basics? What's the purpose of these devices? How do they work?
So these devices really rely on the fact that a certain protein, hemoglobin, that carries oxygen through the blood, it absorbs light differently than when oxygen is not attached to that protein. So oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin absorb light very differently. So by modeling those absorption characteristics, the device can infer the blood oxygen level, right? We use red and infrared light. So we use light at two different wavelengths and we shine it through the skin and we measure how much light is absorbed and we use that information to try to estimate the level of blood oxygen saturation. It's completely safe and non-invasive. We use the same light that's found something like a TV remote control, right? Some TV remote controls use radio frequency signals. Some of the older ones still use the infrared light. And so we're using the same sort of principles.
So you talked about how pulse oximeters have stayed the same in terms of their core design for about 4 decades. What's causing the issue with regards to the discrepancy in their performance?
There are many different types of pulse oximeters on the market. There are hundreds of manufacturers of pulse oximeters, all with different levels of accuracy. Some follow what we call the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration standards, which are set by the United States federal government, has standards for clinical use and the amount of error that can be accepted, right? Because it's not going to be 100% accurate all the time. So there is some error that is acceptable with these devices, and they set those standards. And some of the issues can come about when the devices are not tested on a wide range of users. And we know that melanin is an absorber of light in this range of wavelengths that we use, that we operate pulse oximeters at. So skin melanin concentration can be one confounding factor in affecting the accuracy. Uh, the presence of fingernail polish on the finger could be another confounding factor. Actually, the blood perfusion level can also be another confounding factor. So all these factors need to be accounted for when testing these devices and evaluating them before they're used in clinical settings. I always say the accuracy depends on the situation in which it's being used in, right? So if you have a device and you don't test it on a wide range of skin tones, for example, you can lead it could lead to a device that does not work on all types of users that will encounter the device. That's the main issue. Also, if you are very sick and your blood oxygen is very low, some devices can have higher levels of error at low oxygen saturation. What some of the studies have shown is that pulse oximeters tend to overestimate the blood oxygen saturation for people with dark skin pigmentation. So what that means is that if you have a certain pigment level of melanin and your blood oxygen saturation is low, maybe 85, which is dangerously low, it can overestimate your blood oxygen to be in the 90% range. Several studies have shown this.
And was it during COVID that the discrepancy in the performance across different skin tones first came on your radar? Or was it something that you were already aware of? Like, when did you first learn about this?
Yes, I was aware of the studies before COVID, but again, it was typically those studies were done using consumer grade devices. In the United States, there are over 200 or so pulse oximeters that are FDA approved. So there isn't a comprehensive study over every pulse oximeter that you can encounter on the market. We were aware of some studies, some limited studies that had been done with maybe 50 to 100 patients, very small sample sizes. I also noticed, as an educator, when, teaching biophotonics in the classroom, and I noticed most textbooks, when they talk about the absorption spectra of different biological media like water and lipids, hemoglobin, I noticed that melanin was not mentioned in those textbooks. So to me, that kind of raised a little bit of a red flag too, because that is an important biochemical to be studied. It's an engineering challenge to design a device that, first of all, is based on an empirical formula. We're taking measurements using the device, but then actually the calculation is based on an empirical formula. And it's hard to fit that formula to every person. There are 8 billion people on the planet. Is it very different from something like a blood pressure cuff? Even with a blood pressure cuff, if your arm is fairly big, you have to use a different cuff. They have different cuff sizes, for example, right? So there isn't one blood pressure cuff that can fit every person on the planet. So it's kind of this is there's no one size fit all, I would say, for a pulse oximeter at the moment. For us, it's kind of really going back and thinking more deeply about how these devices actually work. See, skin pigmentation is a major confounding factor. How can we design a device that can compensate for skin pigmentation? You know, so that's one challenge that we're taking on with our patent, is skin tone compensation.
So let's talk about that. So you've decided to take on this challenge of designing a new type of pulse oximeter. You founded a medical device company to commercialize the technology that you've developed in your lab. What was the tipping point that made you say, I need to build a new device?
Well, I think it was a couple of different factors. One is that, I love a challenge. It's a great way to bring together the expertise in my lab. We have built our expertise in designing very high precision micro and nanoscale electrical systems. And if we make things smaller, we can reduce noise. And reducing noise also always kind of helps to improve accuracy when designing any kind of electrical system. And so we wanted to use that expertise, our expertise in AI and machine learning techniques, to help us with this problem. And also in basically how we actually process the signals that we actually receive from the device. And so we have just sort of applied a number of different techniques. A lot of my skills in radio frequency system design, right? We use cell phones, and cell phones pick up radio frequency signals that have traveled from very, very long distances and have to travel through clouds and across buildings and through various structures to get from one point to another. And it has to do it in a very noisy environment. There's a lot of our radio frequency activity going on in our environment at many different frequencies, right? And those systems work very well without colliding with each other, right? You can talk on your cell phone sitting right next on the train with someone else, and your phone calls don't collide, right? So we know how to process and build very sensitive systems that can pick up very low amplitude, weak radio frequency signals in noisy environments. And so I use a lot of the core principles in electrical and computer engineering that I've studied over time and I teach in my classes, applying that to solve this particular problem and thinking about it in a new and a fresh way.
We'll be back to the conversation in a moment. But first, I wanted to let you know about a podcast that I think you'll enjoy checking out. Overlooked is all about the women's health gap and the real ways that impacts women's lives. It's hosted by Golda Arthur and it features immersive and powerful stories that explain the science of our bodies in a way that everyone can understand. Golda is a fantastic storyteller, and I think you'll really enjoy discovering the show. You can search for Overlooked wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show. So tell us, what is different about your approach? Tell us a bit more about the device that you and your team are developing.
So what's significant about our approach really is that, we're trying to think about signal integrity, right? We're trying to think about signal integrity before we even try to compute oxygen saturation. We're trying to ask ourselves, am I picking up the cleanest high fidelity signal that I can from the body? And so we tried to kind of think about from a signal to noise point of view, like how much signal are we processing versus how much noise. And so we did a lot of advanced signal processing. We have a patent that focuses on the ability to compensate for skin tone, where we know that melanin is an absorber in the same range of wavelengths that we're trying to transmit through the finger. So how do we compensate for the absorption of light as the light passes through the skin, which can encounter melanin? I think the first thing, though, is having inclusivity in mind. To start off thinking that we're going to design a device that works over the full range of skin tones that are encountered on our planet. And I think that's the first core principle, and ensuring that we design a device that can do that.
So pulse oximeters used in hospitals have to be approved by regulators. In the US, what's needed for the device to be approved?
The Food and Drug Administration, or also known as FDA, approves medical devices for use in hospitals and other healthcare settings. And the current standard, which has been in place for a number of years, is that you test on at least 10 individuals and you ensure that out of those 10 individuals or the sample size that's used for testing, you ensure that a certain percentage of the sample size has dark skin pigmentation, which is quite subjective. And they tried to ensure that within the sample size, you have a range of different ages, different genders. And the goal is to try to have a test sample size that reflects the population in a way that will give you a sense of the error performance of the device.
So essentially, the pulse oximeters on the market are meeting those standards.
Yes, based on the way the standard is currently written, they do go through this approval process before they're used in healthcare settings. And part of the discussion that happened after the release of Dr. Schoening's paper and other studies that came after that, there was a push for more discussion about these regulations. And there were a number of open forums that were hosted by the FDA, which allowed scientists, researchers, medical device manufacturers, and just the public at large to come together and to provide comments and suggestions and recommendations about how those standards should change.
And how are you testing the device to ensure that it works on a diverse population?
So we used a industry standard lab that's based in California at the University of California, San Francisco. There is a lab called the Hypoxia Lab, and they actually perform testing, what we call a controlled desaturation study. They take healthy individuals and they have them inhale a certain amount of gas that can change their blood oxygen from 70% and modulate it all the way up to 100%. So it's a controlled hypoxia study. And at that lab, they have instrumentation and they recruit participants to conduct measurements on. And so many medical device manufacturers will use this lab in order to generate data that they submit to the FDA for their device approval. They ensure that you actually can meet the FDA standard of having at least 15% of your test population with dark skin pigmentation.
And I'm curious what your device looks like. Does it look like a standard pulse oximeter that you can clip on the end of your finger? Does it look a bit different?
Oh, yes, it does. And I do have a picture that I can provide for you to show, but it's actually a two-part device. There's a part that sits on the wrist, which looks like more like an Apple Watch, for example. And then there's a wire connection to a finger clip. It's a two-part device at the moment, just because we're using off-the-shelf components, which are kind of bulky. But the ultimate goal is to miniaturize it into a single finger clip. And we can do that by using semiconductor device manufacturing. So, which is another area of expertise in my lab, is building nano and micro scale electrical systems onto a small microchip. So we can take all of the functionality from the wrist watch part of the device and actually integrate it into something that is miniaturized and more wearable and a small compact form factor.
As you approach this challenge of developing a new device, what's been the most daunting aspect?
I wouldn't say it was daunting. I mean, we love a challenge, particularly with designing electrical systems and systems that can be used to capture biometric data. I think it's extraordinary the capabilities that we have at our fingertips, right, to do this type of work. And so what we wanted to do though is just ensure that integrity, right? We want to maintain the integrity of the device and making sure that we're thinking about inclusivity throughout. It's a hard problem to try to solve. And so thinking about, I think the business aspect of it is probably something that was new for my lab. I mean, again, I'm a researcher, I'm a professor. I'm used to teaching classes. I do research projects. It's not often that we take our research and we kind of spin it out into something that can be sold off the shelf, right? I mean, that ends up in stores or ends up in hospitals. I mean, it's great when you can make that happen, but there's a lot of investment and research that goes into commercializing a medical device. And so we have tried to engage with accelerator programs. We just finished a business development program funded by the National Science Foundation just the summer of 2025. And we spent 2 months actually having interviews with 100 different potential customers for our medical device. So we try to meet with sort of a wide range of stakeholders. And, the medical device market, just kind of understanding how to conduct market research, how to understand how hospitals actually purchase medical equipment. And so I think it helped us appreciate the complexity of the whole medical device landscape as an industry, because hospitals don't buy just one component. They buy suites of components. They buy bedside monitors that monitor many different biometrics, not just blood oxygen. And so it's not that simple. So we try to think about a business model for marketing our device that would help us to get to market quickly. We're pursuing a couple of different routes. One is working with a large medical device manufacturer and licensing our technology to that manufacturer, just so that we could have a wider reach in terms of the hospitals that we can reach. Also working with large distributors that have catalogs of medical devices that hospitals use to purchase equipment, getting our product in that medical device catalog. How do we go about that process? And then as another route, going directly to consumers. I think we have a niche market that we can really fill a gap, and that is designing an affordable medical device that can be sold directly to consumers.
I read a stat that just 5% of American engineers are Black and less than 2% are Black women. You're one of the 2%. Just curious how that shaped the way you approach your work.
I think it gives certain level of urgency to try to tackle engineering challenges that directly affect people of color. We hear this all the time that, we need to be at the table, we need to be in the room. I think this is a clear example of that, being able to bring voice, in an engineering design team to say, hey, let's think about it deeply and let's think about a solution that can be inclusive for a wider range of the population.
I understand that researchers at other universities are also developing alternative versions of the pulse oximeter. Is there a lot more funding for this type of research?
I would say not enough. I'm privileged to live in a state like Massachusetts, for example, where at the state level, our governor is putting funding towards health equity research. And so I have applied for 2 or 3 grants just over the past 3 or 4 years. We're seeing more grant funding at the state level, which is focused on women's health and are really trying to tackle health disparities. At the national level, so I've noticed, particularly since 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic, I think there was a renewed interest in putting more funding towards tackling these issues. So yes, I'm really glad to see that we're starting to make some inroads, but there's more that can be done.
For any aspiring engineers and founders listening, what's one takeaway that you'd want to leave them with?
I think that this is a wonderful time to be an engineer, to be a scientist, because we do have a number of global challenges facing humanity, and we have the ability to solve them. Your talents and skills can be used to really make a difference in the world, and always look for those opportunities and make a difference.
How can people learn more and follow your work?
So I'm on LinkedIn, or you can also find me at Tufts on the Tufts website at engineering.tufts.edu/ECE/Koomson.
Thank you so much for joining me, Valencia. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you so much, Tosin.
That was Tufts University Professor Valencia Koomson. I've included links in the show notes if you'd like to learn more about her work. For more on this topic, you should also check out my interview with Dr. Michael Schoding from the University of Michigan, who Valencia referred to in this episode. He led a study examining racial bias in pulse oximeters that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2020. I've linked to that episode in the show notes. Thank you for listening to this episode of Made for Us. If you liked it, let us know by leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And don't forget to text it to a friend or colleague who hasn't discovered this show yet. I'm Tosin Suleiman. See you next time.